Good day. Welcome to SO 104. Study Session 3. Theory of Consumer Behavior. Introduction. Consumers have to choose from many thousands of goods available in the market. In other words, they are faced with the problem of choice. In the consumer's decision process, utility comes into play. When a good is consumed, the consumer derives satisfaction or benefit from the goods. This is termed utility in economics. That is, the satisfaction gained from the consumption of a particular good or service. In this session, you will explore the theory behind consumer behavior. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Define and use correctly the following terms: utility, total utility, marginal utility. 2. Explain the law of diminishing marginal utility. 1. Concept of utility. 1. Element of utility. Utility is not synonymous with usefulness. Something may be useful but possess no utility. For example, water to a drowning man possesses no utility. 2. Utility has no ethical or medical significance. Something may be bad but may still possess utility. For instance, a stick of cigarette, even though of no nutritional value, gives satisfaction, utility to the smoker. 3. Utility is related to time. The amount of satisfaction derived from a particular commodity varies with time. The utility derived from a bottle of cold Coke is higher during the dry season than during the cold weather. 4. Utility derived depends on an individual. Every individual tries to gain the greatest possible utility with the amount of resources available. That is, the maximum utility attainable is subject to the size of one's resources. 1. Utility of firm. This is increasing the utility of an article by changing its form, especially through manufacturing process. 2. Utility of place. This is increasing the utility of commodity by changing its geographical point. Transportation of sand and stones from quarry confers more utility on them at the urban center where they are being used for building purposes. 3. Utility of time. Time-space can confer utility on commodity. For instance, storing of agricultural products during harvest time confers more utility on them during scarce period, off-season. Measurement of utility. Some 19th century economists believed that utility can be measured as if it were a physical commodity. In other words, just as it can be measured in kilograms, utility should be similarly measured in its own unit called utils. These economists were known as the cardinalists because they stated that cardinal numbers should be used to express utility. Example: a consumer may obtain 10 utils from a bowl of pap but only 5 utils from a plate of rice. The conclusion of the cardinalists will be that the consumer obtained twice as much utility from the pap than from the rice, and the absolute difference between utility derived from both commodities is 5 utils. However, by the 1930s, economists were coming to the conclusion that utility cannot be measured cardinally. These economists were known as ordinalists. They claimed that an individual can rank bundle of goods in order of preference because he or she prefers one bundle to another, or he or she derives more utility from the bundle preferred than from the others, or he or she derives same utility from two sets of goods. In this case, only ordinal numbers, first, second, and third, etc., can be used to rank bundles of goods, and this shows nothing about the absolute difference between the two sets of goods. Concepts in utility. Of every important consideration in this approach is the concept of total utility, marginal utility, and the hypothesis of diminishing marginal utility. A. Total utility. This is the total amount of satisfaction derived from all the units of a commodity consumed at a particular time. B. Marginal utility. This is the extra utility derived from the consumption of one more unit of a good, while the consumption of other goods remains constant. The increase or decrease in the supply, because this is where the decisions are made, and marginal utility enters into the determination of value and price. Consider an individual's consumption of good X over a period of time as shown in table 5.1. Law of diminishing marginal utility. This states that as you take or consume more and more of a commodity, the total utility tends to increase up to a certain level, saturation point, and any additional intake beyond this level will lead to a decrease in the marginal utility. From the above table, the law of diminishing marginal utility sets in at the third quantity because the marginal utility drops from 30 to 10, though the total utility increases from 50 to 60. Utility maximization. A demand for a product exists because it provides the user some utility. Therefore, the key concept behind demand is marginal utility. It is clear, therefore, that the law of diminishing marginal utility is the basis for the third law of demand. The demand curve can therefore be derived from the utility theory. The height of the demand curve reflects marginal utility. The marginal utility curve resembles the demand curve. The explanation is that additional units of a commodity consumed gives less utility. Diminishing marginal utility. So the consumer will consume more of the commodity at lower prices. This means that the consumer's price represents the additional amount of satisfaction which he hopes to derive from purchasing additional or more units of the commodity. A consumer at any point in time wants to equate the marginal utility of a product to its price. If the marginal utility of a commodity were above the price paid for it, it means the consumer valued the extra unit more than he had paid for it. Hence, he or she will increase his or her purchases more units of the commodity. Therefore, the tendency is to arrange purchases in such a way that the marginal utility of any good is equal to its price. MUX equals PX. MUY equals 25 and PY equals 5. MUX over PX 20 over 4 equals 5 utils per unit price of commodity X. MUY over PY equals 25 over 5 equals 5 utils per unit of commodity Y. In the example above, the consumer will be indifferent because what it derives per unit price of each of the commodity is the same. Supposing the price of commodity X changes to N2, MUX over PX equals 20 over 2 equals 10 utils per unit of commodity X. The consumer will buy more of X, thus connoting more satisfaction. Generally, as the price of one commodity drops in response to the other commodity, more of the commodity is consumed, but a point will be reached where the ratio of marginal utility to the price of one commodity, MUX over PX, will be equal to the ratio of marginal utility to the price of the other, MUY over PY. This is the point at which the consumer will be indifferent, that is, he derives the same satisfaction from either commodity. Difference curves. In the ordinalist approach, consumer is presumed to prefer and rank commodities rather than assign util values. The consumer's preference for commodities X and Y, for instance, can usefully be analyzed by means of indifferent curves. The significance of these curves will be discussed in this section. After 1930s, during the interwar years, J.R. Hicks and other economists began to shift attention from the cardinal aspect of utility to its ordinal aspect, that is, the utility from different combinations of commodities could be ranked in order of preference by consumers. Indifference analysis assumes that among various combinations of any two commodities, a consumer can distinguish combinations which are of equal utility to him and between which is indifferent, so that he can rank different combinations in order of preference. Suppose that there are only two commodities available to the consumer, say X and Y. If he has 4 units of commodity X and 1 unit of commodity Y, he will obtain a certain amount of satisfaction for this combination of goods. Now let us say he has 3 units of commodity X. For him to stay on the same level of satisfaction as before, he needs 2 units of Y. Then he can say that he or she was indifferent to 4 units of X plus 1 unit of Y amount of satisfaction from either combination. Let us look at 4 combinations for this consumer at which he is indifferent. Comparing combinations 1 and 2, we can see that 1 more unit of Y compensates for the loss of 1 unit of X. However, comparing combinations 2 and 3, we can see that 2 units of Y are now necessary to compensate for the loss of 1 additional unit of X. The implication is that as the amount of X becomes smaller and the amount of Y greater, X becomes more and more significant and Y less and less significant. Hence, more and more of Y is required to compensate for the loss of successive units of X. Another combination that will yield another level of satisfaction can be obtained from the same consumer. For example, if these 2 indifference curves are plotted on a single graph, they yield an indifference map. It should be noted that the rationality of the consumer on the combination principle is based on the following. 1. He must be able to rank his preference over the entire field of choice facing him. 2. His behavior must be transitive. If he prefers A to B and B to C, he must therefore prefer A to C. 3. There is diminishing marginal rate of substitution, and this is depicted by the slope of the indifference curve or rate of substituting X for Y. 4. The total utility of the consumer depends on the quantity of individual commodity consumed. There are, in reality, an infinite number of indifference curves on an indifference map, but any of those that are of interest and relevance from any particular analysis are shown. It should be noted that a higher indifference curve denotes greater satisfaction than a lower one. The slope of indifference curve is called the marginal rate of substitution, MRS. That is, the ratio at which X is substituted for Y without the consumer being either better or worse off. Characteristics of indifference curves. 1. Indifference curves do not intersect. 2. Indifference curves slope downward from left to right. As the quantity of Y decreases, the quantity of X must increase. Otherwise, the same quantity of X and different quantities of Y will be equally desirable. 3. It is convex to the origin. This is because the commodities are not perfect substitutes, neither are they complements, and as one moves along the curve from left to right, there is a diminishing marginal rate of substitution. 4. The further away from the origin the curve lies, the better for the consumer, that is, the higher the level of satisfaction. Study session summary. In this study session, you learned the key elements that are related to utility as a concept in economics. Types of utility were examined as well as the methods of measuring utility. We also look at concepts of total utility, marginal utility, law of diminishing marginal utility, and utility maximization. We went further to explore the significance of indifference curve and how practically utilities are substituted. We concluded the session by highlighting the major characteristics of indifference curves. End of study session 3. Thank you for listening.